My next guest is Suzanne DeMallie. Suzanne is the author of Can You Hear Me Now? She is a speaker, former math teacher, and a founder of a nonprofit organization. She was an ordinary CPA and a mother of three prior to 2005. That's when she was told that her son had an auditory processing disorder, and she began researching information to learn more about his diagnosis and how she could help him. What she uncovered was a much greater problem that impacted every student in the typical classroom. She learned that all students could miss as much as a third of what their teachers said due to poor classroom acoustics and immature neurological hearing abilities. There was a simple, cost-effective solution: give a teacher a wireless microphone and put speakers in the classroom. As author of the best-selling book, Can You Hear Me Now?, Suzanne honestly addresses the problems in education that leave so many children behind. She also encourages parents and educators to join the conversation to generate improvements in our public educational system and guides them through the process using her own successful experience. She wants public education to be a better choice for all students. Welcome to the podcast, Suzanne.
Thank you, Dana.
Well, tell me about a time when you were in the trenches and managed to crawl out.
I can think of two circumstances. One is a parent and the other is a teacher. As a parent, I think when I first heard my son's diagnosis, which was in January 2005, I felt very just overwhelmed, defeated, sad, scared, frustrated, everything. I just really, how am I going to pull myself out of this and pull my son out of it? And what eventually really did pull me out was starting to do research to learn more about the problem and, how I could help him. Mm-hmm. And then as a teacher, I think when my first year as a full-time permanent teacher in Baltimore County, you get observed a lot. And I believe it was my second of 4 observations that year. I got a rating that said like developing. It wasn't it wasn't a great rating. And, I had just been so nervous and so overwhelmed with trying to do everything that I was told had to be in that lesson and that observation, that it wasn't mine. It lost what eventually made me a good teacher. And I overcame that by getting that poor rating. It just made me realize I need to make it my own, for better or for worse, and so I did like a follow-up lesson after that, which the principal came in to observe, and it was really good. It was like one of my best observations. And and eventually somebody, I think it was the principal, asked me, you were so relaxed and like it was so good, like what do you think made it so different? And I said it was mine. It was I did it the way I thought it should be done. And so those are just two examples.
Yeah, and I think not all the new teachers are that successful in overcoming that developing rating after a few observations, right? That you're able to kind of pick up your feet and just kind of turn it totally around in the following observation. So the fact that you kind of just included the key components, you stuck to the curriculum, and you were able to gain your principal's respect, correct?
Yes. And that, knowing that I had that respect, and I could tell by her response that, I think that also just then gave me more confidence to go forward.
So I talked in the bio about your book, Can You Hear Me Now? Talk to me a little bit about the writing process, if this is something that you'd been collecting research for since 2005, but just recently wrote, kind of how that the whole book came about.
I hadn't been collecting research all along. I really didn't sit down and seriously start to write it until probably late summer 2019. Mm-hmm. And I did the research and the writing all within really like a period of 6 months, but it was just full time every day. But what kind of started the idea about a book is really coming home after a long day of teaching and sharing stories at the dinner table with my family. And, they would listen to the stories and say, wow, you need to write a book about this. And so the idea was a little bit planted in my head, I guess, about it. And then I had the opportunity to give a speech at a college for a women in leadership brunch. And my speech was really focused mostly on the work that I had done to raise awareness about the hearing issues in the classroom and to advocate for that technology in the classroom. And I then sort of finished off my speech with my current experience at the time as a teacher. I was still teaching. And I talked about, just the issues that I was seeing in the schools, in the classroom, and how, we really needed to speak up about those kinds of things too. And the response afterwards really just surprised me, because the audience was, some people were crying, some people were smiling. A lot of people came up to me afterwards and said just how inspiring it was and how they learned so much and they wanted to know more. And so I really then started to think seriously about the book. About writing a book someday.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. It wasn't like I went home and started writing. And then I had an experience as a teacher that just really kind of solidified my, I guess, my purpose and that it was necessary to sit down and write something. And that was when I had a student that I felt like needed to be held back because he was just so far behind in math and reading, years behind, and I wasn't able to help him the way he needed help. And I had recommended that he be not moved on to 5th grade. And the ultimate decision was, well, we're going to move him on anyway, because there's so many other children in our school that in 4th grade that are further behind than where he is, and they're going to be moving on. So he has to move with them. And to me, I just, that reasoning was just so flawed. And I felt like, wow, we're doing a disservice to these children, and we're lying to the parents about how capable they are. And I just felt like something needed to be said. And too many times through, as a teacher, I found myself thinking, why is it this way? Somebody needs to do something. And I think it was after that I felt like maybe I'm the somebody.
So in the pre-chat, you told me that in 19 is when you resigned from teaching, and you spent those 6 months working on the book. But was that shortly after you kind of had that thought of somebody needs to do something, and that's kind of how you moved out of the classroom?
Yeah, that meeting happened, I think it was in 2018. So it wasn't that much longer afterwards. It just, it just really stuck in my head. And I really had that thought that just people need to know about these issues.
Yeah.
And I really felt like not only do they need to know about them, but I thought, I'm sort of unique because I had given that speech I talked about where I shared what I had done for the hearing issues. And how people were inspired by that. And I thought, maybe there's an opportunity here to not only talk about the problems in education, but to share my story on what I did and encourage people. We can all speak up. We can all make this better if we all take on an issue and try to reform it and speak up about it. So that's kind of how that evolved.
And since the book came out, I know you've been on other podcasts that I've heard, and have you gotten a fairly good reception of both from district leaders and school leaders and just people that are kind of filtering that knowledge down to teachers in the classroom?
Yeah, the response has been very positive. People who might not feel so positive about it haven't reached out to me, so I'm sure there's some people out there, but overall it's been really positive. And it has I think started some conversations. There was a teacher who wrote a note to me, and he is a longtime teacher. He's been in the system for over 30 years, and he read the book And then he bought a copy for his principal and gave it to her before spring break and said, would you read this over spring break? And then can we set a meeting to sit down and talk about the, some issues in our school? And they had that meeting. And, I don't know what they talked about in the meeting, but the fact that they had the meeting and that, they had a conversation.
Yeah.
That's the goal of the book. So yeah, it's been pretty positive. Some people have I think some teachers have actually said to me, wow, you put into words what I've been thinking for so long. And so, I just hope that that people, again, just have that conversation and then take some steps afterwards to say, what can we do? And whether it's maybe not on a systemic level, they're not saying let's make a big change nationwide, but what can I at least do in my classroom or in my school to start making things better? And that's the goal.
Because when I'm thinking about that, like what teachers can do in their classrooms, it's kind of like, I would say maybe advocating for getting a sound system, those type of things, because in different classes I've been in, it's been very rare that, maybe I've had a student on a 504 or an IEP that, you need the sound system, but this should be, there for all teachers according to what you've learned, because, students may not have any identified, processing issue or anything, but just for them to hear better. And teachers, I think, like you say, teachers always feel like we have this teacher voice, but we assume, the class can hear us. But what are your thoughts on just kind of for teachers to advocate for the sound system, and especially since we're still teaching in masks, and I sometimes will like pull it out a little bit to amplify the sound, but it's just hard to know, like, unless you're doing a survey, like, can everybody hear me well, right? Or the back of the room, right? And then you told me, like, with the sound system, you don't have those classroom management issues because everybody knows what you're saying at all times.
Right. So first of all, I would just flat out say that I believe teacher microphones and speakers are an educational necessity, and that every regular sized classroom should have one. And the reason that I would say that, and I'll share it with your listeners, because they can use this information then to help advocate for it, because that's really an important part of being able to speak up about the issue, is understanding it. There are really, first of all, you're right, children can miss up to 1/3 of what their teacher is saying in a classroom. And the reasons for that is, first of all children do not have those fully developed neurological hearing abilities until their early teens, around age 15. And what people don't realize is that and this even relates to the problem my son had, although obviously his was much more extreme. Children, our ears are just capturing signals, and then the brain has to try to discriminate and between those sounds, identify them, recognize them, and ultimately comprehend them. And children go through a much more difficult process to do all that than an adult. An adult is just automatic. And when you put an adult in a room where the acoustics are maybe not so great, such as a classroom, because acoustics are really poor in a classroom, an adult's brain is able to automatically fill in any missing pieces of a word that somebody just doesn't hear because the background noise is a little loud. And children just, they don't have the ability to do that, especially the younger the child. And there's also the teacher's voice, and you talked about, the loud teacher's voice. All voices, when you're talking, the volume of that voice drops over distance. And so no matter how much you're trying to project it, it's going to drop off. And beyond about 8 feet from the teacher, that sometimes the background noise in a classroom can actually even be louder than the volume of the teacher's voice beyond 8 feet, because it's declined over distance. So children that are seated in the middle to the rear of the classroom are absolutely at a disadvantage for being able to hear what the teacher is saying. And then also there are a significant number of children that have either a permanent or a temporary hearing impairment. When I did research in 2005, at that time, it was roughly 15% of our student population had a permanent hearing impairment. And today that number has risen to 20%.
Okay.
And then there's another 10 to 15% of children that especially at the elementary level, that have a temporary hearing loss from ear infections because of fluid being trapped in their ears. So, that's a pretty sizable portion of the students that are sitting in a class that may have an actual hearing loss, either permanent or temporary. But again, all children, even with completely normal hearing and processing abilities, are at a disadvantage in the classroom because of poor acoustics and because that teacher's voice drops over distance. So when you give a teacher a microphone to use and you put some speakers, one or more speakers in the room, it amplifies the teacher's voice by 8 to 10 decibels. And the speakers are what allow that voice to just filter around the whole room like a surround sound effect. And so there is no dropping off of the teacher's voice, and every child then gets equal access to what the teacher is saying.
Okay.
Because, even if a child is seated in the front row of the classroom, the teacher moves around the classroom. A good teacher is not going to be standing in one spot. So even with preferential seating, the child at some point is going to be missing out on what a teacher says, unless you have that microphone and the speakers. And behavior, I used one as a teacher. I advocated for it as a parent. And then years later, when I became a teacher, I was lucky enough that I had a portable system myself, and from all the work I had done in the past. And so I brought it to school and used it. And it made an absolute huge difference for behaviors. Because, when anyone has trouble, even an adult, when they have trouble listening effectively, you tune out. You just sort of you tune out, you start doing your own thing, doodling on the paper or having a conversation with the person next to you. And so if they can hear more clearly, and they don't have to go through as much effort also to hear, because again, kids, require more effort to process sounds, then they become more engaged and on task. And you don't have to yell when you're using one of these microphones. And that just changes the atmosphere in the room. I taught a lot of kids. I was in a Title I school, and there were a lot of, some disturbing family situations for some of the kids that I was teaching. And I think they probably had a lot of yelling in some of their households. And I never had to yell in my classroom. I could be an effective teacher with just a conversational tone of voice because of that microphone. And that, I believe, really, really made a huge difference.
Yeah. And when I've used those, I feel the same. It's like you're not straining your voice. You keep it calm emotionally, I think, too, just because you're having that. You feel like you have more control because you are being heard more, and
you do. And you don't become as physically fatigued because you're not trying to raise your voice all day, because that takes its toll on anyone physically.
Let's talk a little bit about your professional speaking. So you talked about some of the speaking that you did before you became a teacher, and then that you have something lined up at a teacher's college, I think this fall, and kind of what you're planning on speaking to them about.
Yes. Well, in the past I spoke to the National PTA Association, the National School Board Association, lots of politicians and, school board members and teachers and all that. And that was a long time ago. And now I'm again trying to, raise awareness again on issues in education and get people to join me in the conversation. So I am now trying to target colleges and universities who have education programs, because I feel like as a teacher, you often feel very you sort of start to give up and feel very helpless and hopeless sometimes in in being able to have control over, what you teach and how you teach it, and maybe just some circumstances where you are. And really, we all do have some power within us to make changes. And so that's really what I'm trying to talk about, and, raise awareness on issues, but also say, give people some tools and some steps that I used to speak out, that they can also use to effectively make the changes they want to see. So I do have one coming up just in 2 weeks at Salisbury University in Maryland. That'll be my first one. And then I am also lining up some other speaking events that are not at colleges and universities, but educational venues.
Yeah, it's a very important for teachers to learn about that in the teacher prep program. Trying to advocate for the sounds and stones before they even are in the classroom, or before they do their student teaching, just so they start their career with that. And It's not, I don't think it's really all that expensive for the school to provide, and it's something that I think is as necessary as a whiteboard, right?
Oh yes, more so. And I'll tell you why more, because kids spend approximately 75% of their school day engaged in auditory learning. Yeah. So that's most of their day, and a teacher talks for most of the day, in some degree. So you will use that piece of equipment more than you will use any other piece of equipment that you have in your classroom. Guaranteed.
Yeah, I kind of get that. Like you're saying, you're speaking a lot more than you're necessarily writing on the board. So yeah, definitely they can see the board, but yeah, they can't always hear you. So
right.
So I'm curious to hear about how your son's doing now, kind of his journey after you were starting to advocate 17 years ago, and where is he at now in life?
Well, back when I started advocating, he was in kindergarten, and that's when he was diagnosed. And it was spring of that year when I first went to the Board of Education and started sharing this information with them and speaking up that we need to put money in the budget for this equipment. And 10 months after that, the Board of Education, Baltimore County's Board of Education, did put $400,000 in their budget to start getting the equipment in schools. And his school that he was moving into for first grade was one of the recipients of the technology early on. So fortunately, he had access to it fairly early in elementary school. And he's doing great today. He just graduated from college last May, and he's just doing great, and he has a job. And so it's been a happy ending to that story.
Well, I've learned a lot about just the need for amplification systems and what teachers should advocate for in their classrooms. And it's an issue that I just think, we kind of had, we thought about as general classroom teachers, but not always maybe been so aware of if we don't have kids that have had that on their IEP or 504. So out of everything we've talked about in this whole conversation around student hearing, what's the one thing you'd like listeners to remember?
Well, in regards to hearing, that, hearing is the foundation of learning. And if you can't hear for any reason at all, it's going to impact your ability to learn. So, and this is just such an easy way. There's so many problems in education that are difficult to correct, and this is such an easy problem to correct. And you're right, it's really not that expensive. It's less than the cost of one computer in the classroom, or an iPad or something. So, spend the money and get it. It really makes a big difference.
Well, where can people connect with you and find you online?
If they go to my website, which is SuzanneDeMallie.com, that's the best way to learn more about me, more about my book. I have tons of information about the hearing issues we were talking about on there that they could use as a resource to advocate for it in their school or their district. And they can also contact me through there, reach out to me personally, or connect with me on social media.
Great. Well, I'll put that in the show notes. Thank you so much for being a guest on the Out of the Trenches podcast today.
Thank you.